The drought had held Briar Hollow by the throat for 3 months straight. Creek beds turned to powder, garden soil cracked into patterns that looked like old skin, like the land itself was dying of thirst one slow day at a time. Wells that had served families for 20 years coughed up mud, and then nothing at all. The sky stayed white and mean, offering heat but never mercy, and the whole of Wyoming territory shimmered under a silence that felt like God had simply looked away. Now, some men carry their love in their mouths. They got pretty words and soft speeches and know just what to say when a woman needs hearing. Caleb Dawson was not that kind of man. Caleb Dawson carried his love in his hands. But on this particular July afternoon, with the sun hammering down like an anvil, those hands were shaking, not from work, from fear. His boy hung limp against his shoulder, 7 years old, burning hotter than the air around them, breathing in little stuttered gasps that made Caleb's chest close up tight. He'd carried Eli a mile and a half down the main road, past the shuttered doctor's office, past the apothecary with its empty shelves, and now he stood at the edge of town where a cabin sat back from the road beneath a pair of cottonwood trees that had somehow kept their leaves. The cabin had seen better days. Porch rail split down the middle, fence posts leaning like tired men, roof patched with mismatched shingles. Through the front window he could see books, a whole stack of them, piled on the floor beside a child's chair. A hand-painted sign hung beside the door, and Ellison Healing and Remedies. Caleb climbed the crooked steps. Before he could knock, the door opened. A woman stood there, dark hair pinned back, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hands that smelled of calendula and sage. Her eyes went straight to the boy. She didn't ask questions. She didn't ask for money. She stepped aside the way a person does when they understand that some things can't wait for conversation. Caleb carried his son inside. He laid Eli on the healer's cot, and his hands, dry and cracked and rough as the ground beneath him, released the only thing in this world he had left to hold. He smoothed Eli's hair back from his burning forehead, tucking a loose strand behind the boy's ear the way he did every night, making his son look cared for even when caring was all he had to give. Then he backed toward the door, because standing inside a stranger's home while your son might be dying felt like something that required permission he didn't know how to ask for. Nora Ellison had been a healer long enough to know that fever was a liar. It promised death all night and sometimes broke by morning like it had only been passing through. The trick was staying steady through the dark hours. Cool cloths, yarrow tea, patience that most folks didn't possess. She worked quietly, stripped the boy's shirt, bathed his chest with well water she'd been rationing for days, mixed a tincture of elderflower and willow bark, spooned it past his cracked lips while his father sat on the broken porch outside, hat in his hands, unable to come inside and unable to leave. She knew that kind of man. Her late husband, Thomas, had been cut from similar cloth, all promise and good intentions. But when the consumption took hold, he'd kept working the fields until he collapsed because asking for help felt to him like a kind of dying. She'd buried him on the hill behind the cabin and sworn she'd never again depend on someone who couldn't admit when they were breaking. That oath had kept her upright for 5 years. It had also kept her alone. It was Willa Mae who took the night watch. Nora's daughter was 10 years old and serious as a sermon. She pulled a chair beside the cot without being asked, wrung a cloth in cool water, and pressed it gentle against the boy's forehead. When his breathing turned ragged, she opened a book, a collection of horse stories she'd read 4 times already, and began reading aloud in a voice so calm and steady it could have soothed a spooked Mustang. Nora watched from the kitchen doorway, her daughter's small hands replacing the cloth each time it warmed, her daughter's voice filling the dark cabin with words about wild stallions and open plains, until the boy's fists unclenched and his breathing slowed and he slept. Come sunrise, the fever broke. Caleb stepped inside at first light. He saw his son sleeping peaceful, a girl's book open on the pillow beside him, the 10-year-old asleep in the chair with her fingers still resting near the cloth. His voice came out rough and low. I ain't got money. I can chop wood, mend your roof, fix anything that's broken. Nora dried her hands on her apron. We don't take payment for healing, Mr. Dawson. He nodded once, left without another word. But as Nora cleared the porch that morning, she noticed something. The loose board on the top step, the one she'd been stepping careful around for 6 months, was tight, nailed flush, fixed some time in the dark by a man who couldn't sleep and couldn't sit still and couldn't accept a kindness without answering it with his hands. Caleb made it halfway down the road before he stopped walking. Eli rode his shoulders, weak but awake, fingers curled in his father's collar. The boy smelled like sage and someone else's kindness, and Caleb didn't know what to do with that. He stood in the road and looked back. The cabin sat crooked against the morning sky, fence leaning, porch rail split, shingles curling at the edges like pages in a book left out in weather. Everything about it spoke the same language he'd been living inside for 3 years. Not laziness, just a person with too much work and not enough hands. His own story was simple enough. Farm outside of Laramie, wife who wanted more than dust and silence. One morning she was gone, her side of the bed still warm, her coat missing from the hook. Then the fire took what was left, and Caleb loaded Eli into a borrowed wagon and started moving because standing still felt too much like drowning. 3 years of that. 3 years of his boy asking when they'd have a home, and Caleb changing the subject because the honest answer was a weight no child should carry. He looked down at his hands, cracked across every knuckle, dry as the creek beds, but steady. These hands could swing a hammer, plane a board, set a post true. That was the one thing poverty hadn't stripped from him, the knowing of how to build. He turned around. Next morning he was on Nora Ellison's porch at first light with a hammer borrowed from the livery. She opened the door, saw him standing there, and went still in the frame. She didn't invite him in. She didn't send him away. Her eyes moved from the hammer to the split porch rail and back to his face, and whatever she saw there made her step inside without a word. The hammer fell, the first nail bit wood, and somewhere behind the glass, a 10-year-old girl set a glass of water on the windowsill, close enough for him to reach without having to come inside. By the time the leaves started turning, Caleb Dawson had rebuilt half of Nora Ellison's homestead without either of them discussing it. That first week had been the strangest. He'd arrive before sunup, and Nora would hear the hammer from the kitchen and stand at the window holding her coffee with both hands, watching a stranger repair her porch like it was the most natural thing in the world. Neither spoke beyond good morning. He worked. She watched. The silence between them was thick as summer air, not hostile but not comfortable either, like two people learning a language that had no words. By the second week, the silence had softened. By the third, it was something closer to understanding. The porch came first, new rail, sanded smooth, braced underneath so it wouldn't bow. Then the fence, 23 posts straightened and reset, wire pulled taut, gate rehung so it latched clean, then the roof. He worked through that cabin's wounds the way a good doctor reads a patient urgent things first, comfort second, beauty last. He fixed the step Willa Mae tripped on before the window that stuck. He mended the chicken coop latch before the decorative trim above the door. Nora watched and understood something about this man that conversation would never have taught her. He listened with his eyes, and what he heard was everything that mattered. She started leaving water on the porch rail, then coffee, strong enough to float a horseshoe. He never mentioned it. She never explained. Willa Mae took to calling him Mr. Caleb, like she'd been saying it her whole life. She'd bring out bread and preserves each morning and sit on the new rail, asking questions he answered mostly with nods until she learned his silence wasn't unfriendly. It was just his way. Eli, meanwhile, had attached himself to Willa Mae like a burr on a wool sock. He followed her to the garden, to the creek bed, to the chicken coop where she'd named every hen. One afternoon, Nora watched from the window as Eli carried a handful of nails to where Caleb was working the fence line. The boy didn't speak, he just held out his palm, and Caleb took a nail and drove it home. And Eli held out another, father and son working in the same quiet rhythm, side by side, connected by the tap of a hammer and a child's open hand. One evening, Willa Mae set a plate at the supper table, fourth plate. Didn't ask, didn't explain, just set it down in the spot closest to the stove, the warm seat, and went back to slicing bread. Nora stared at that fourth plate for a long moment. She didn't remove it. Caleb had noticed the books the very first night. Willa Mae's collection stacked on the floor beside her reading chair like a little city of stories with no proper foundation. Must have been 15, 20 volumes piled there, some with cracked spines, some with pages soft as cloth from being turned so many times. He didn't mention it, wasn't his place, but the image stayed with him the way certain things do when you recognize a small wrong you have the power to fix. Weeks passed before he gathered the scrap, broken wagon slats from behind the livery, a discarded shipping crate from the general store, fence boards too warped for the rail but still good at the core. He hauled them to the barn after dark, and for 3 evenings he worked by lantern light, sawing, planing, sanding every surface until his fingers could run the length of each board without catching a single rough edge. He built it simple: 4 shelves, graduated height, joints fitted tight enough you couldn't slide a playing card between them, no nails where small fingers might catch a splinter. He used wooden pegs instead, the way his father had taught him before his father died and left him nothing but the knowing of how to make things true and square and lasting. He placed it in Willa Mae's room before dawn and left the way he came. The sound she made when she found it brought Nora running from the kitchen. Here's the thing about a man like Caleb Dawson. He couldn't write a poem to save his life, couldn't string together pretty words or make a speech that would move a congregation to tears. But he could see a girl's books stacked on a bare floor and build her a place to keep them. And sometimes, if you're the kind of person who pays attention, that's the truest language there is. Willa Mae ran her fingers along every shelf like she was reading something written in the wood grain. Then, one by one, she arranged her books, tallest on the bottom, smallest on top, each spine facing out so she could see the titles like old friends standing in a proper receiving line. That evening she moved Mr. Caleb's plate to the warm seat when he sat down for supper for the first time eating at their table. She told her mother something Nora would carry with her for the rest of her natural life. He ain't like the others, Mama. He don't just say thank you, he shows it. Caleb kept his eyes on his plate. His hands, still cracked, still dry, held the fork a little steadier than they had in years. Across the table, Nora watched him, and the distance between four plates shrank to something that was beginning to feel like belonging. The well went dry on a Tuesday in late October, and with it went Nora's last pretense that she could manage on her own. No water meant no healing practice, couldn't mix tinctures, couldn't clean wounds, couldn't brew the teas that half the county depended on. No water meant no garden. And without the garden, there'd be nothing put up for winter. No water meant a woman standing at the edge of a dry hole, dropping the bucket 3 times and hearing nothing come back but rope hitting stone. She pressed her hands flat against the well's edge and closed her eyes. For one terrible moment she saw it all, packing Willa Mae's books back into a crate, loading them into a borrowed wagon, leaving the only home her daughter remembered, starting over somewhere else, alone again, always alone. Caleb arrived at first light. He looked into the well, looked at Nora, said nothing. He started digging 30 feet east of the old well before the sun cleared the cottonwoods. Day after day he broke ground. The soil had baked hard as fired brick through 3 months of drought, and every shovelful fought him like it had a personal grudge. By the third day his hands were bleeding, deep cracks across the palms, blisters torn open and weeping. He wrapped them in strips torn from his own shirt and kept digging. On the fourth morning, Nora came out carrying a clay pot of calendula salve and clean cloth bandages. She knelt beside the hole, 4 feet deep now, 5 feet, and reached for his hands. I'm all right, he said. It ain't that bad. Give me your hands, Caleb. It was the first time she'd used his name without the mister. He went still. Then he lifted his hands out of the dirt and placed them in hers, palms up, like a man laying down something he'd been carrying too long. She cleaned each wound the way she'd cleaned 100 wounds before, but this time her fingers moved slower. These were the hands that had rebuilt her porch. These were the hands that had built her daughter a bookshelf from scrap because a quiet man noticed books stacked on a floor. She wrapped each palm in clean white cloth, winding the bandage careful between his fingers, and neither of them spoke because what was happening between them had nothing to do with words and never had. Eli and Willa Mae hauled small buckets of borrowed water from the neighbor's well while the adults worked in the lengthening shadows. On the seventh day, water rose, dark, cold, clean. Caleb sat at the edge of the new well, hands wrapped in Nora's bandages, and for the first time he didn't leave at sundown. He fell asleep on her porch, too spent to stand, and Nora covered him with a wool blanket and sat in the chair beside him, listening to him breathe, thinking about how a man could say everything that mattered without once opening his mouth. The first hard frost came in December, and with it came the thing Caleb Dawson feared most. Not cold, not hunger, not the deep ache in his hands that winter made worse. What frightened him was simpler than all of that, and more dangerous. He was afraid that he was home. The cabin was sound now, roof tight, porch solid, fence straight, well full. There was nothing left to fix, and without a board to plane or a nail to drive, Caleb had no excuse to walk up that road each morning, no reason that made sense to a man who'd sworn 3 years back that he would never need another living soul again. So he stopped coming. 3 days he stayed in the room above the feed store, staring at the frost on the window, telling himself the debt was paid and the work was done and that was the end of it. He could move on. He always moved on. That was what drifters did. They drifted. Eli sat on the edge of the narrow bed that second evening, kicking his boots against the frame the way he did when something was gnawing at him. Pa, how come we don't go to Miss Nora's no more? Weather's turnin'. Best we stay put. Willa Mae's gonna think I forgot about her. You didn't forget nobody. Then how come we ain't going? Caleb had no answer that wouldn't be a lie. He walked to the window after Eli fell asleep and stood there a long time looking out at nothing. The frost made fern patterns on the glass. His reflection stared back, gaunt, tired, a man who looked older than his 31 years. He turned his hands over in the pale light and studied them, calloused, scarred from the well, rough from months of building something that didn't belong to him but felt more like his than anything had in years. Every nail he'd driven into Nora Ellison's porch was a word he couldn't speak. Every board he'd sanded for Willa Mae's bookshelf was a sentence he didn't have the language to write. Every morning he showed up at first light was a paragraph in a letter he'd never have the courage to send, and it terrified him, because the last time he'd let himself need someone this way, he'd lost everything. The widow who healed his son had healed something in him he'd believed was dead and buried beside the ashes of a farm in Laramie. But what Caleb didn't know, what he couldn't have seen from inside his own fear, was that Nora Ellison had been standing at that kitchen window every morning for 3 days, watching the empty road, waiting for the sound of boots on her mended porch. He sat on the edge of the bed a long time on that fourth morning. Eli was already awake, already dressed, already watching his father with eyes that understood more than a 7-year-old should. Caleb picked up the hammer. There was always something to fix. That front door needed new hinges. He'd noticed weeks ago the way it stuck when cold made the wood swell. Come on, Eli, get your coat. The boy was off the bed before Caleb finished the sentence. The rain came in February, late, gentle, steady, like it had been holding itself back for just this moment. First real rain since July, and when it hit the roof of Nora Ellison's cabin, the sound was so strange and foreign that Willa Mae looked up from her book and asked what it was. Rain, Nora said. Then she said it again, quieter, like she needed to hear the word twice to believe what it meant. Rain. Caleb was on the porch when it started. He'd been fitting new hinges to the front door, the last chore he could possibly invent, the last excuse he could offer himself for being here. The first drops hit the backs of his hands, and he went still. He set the hammer down slow on the rail. He stood and walked to the edge of the porch. The rain came down soft. Not a storm, not a fury. Just a steady, patient falling like the sky had finally remembered what the ground needed. It hit the dust and turned it dark. It beaded on the fence posts he'd straightened. It ran down the new shingles he'd nailed. It pooled in the yard where the old well had been and filled the prints his boots had worn into the path between the gate and the porch over all these months of coming and going and coming back again. Caleb turned his face up. His hands hung open at his sides. The rain filled his palms, ran between his fingers, soaked the calluses and the scars and the cracks that 3 months of drought had put there and 3 months of building had deepened. The dryness broke in the ground, in the air, in him. He stood there and let it. Inside, Nora heard the hammer stop. She stood at the counter where she'd been chopping carrots, and the knife went still in her hand. She listened to the rain on the roof, on the mended roof, and she made a decision that had been building since the night she wrapped his bleeding hands beside the well. She went to the cupboard, took down 4 plates, set them on the table, each one placed deliberate and sure. Willa Mae by the window, Eli beside Willa Mae, Caleb in the warm seat by the stove, hers across from his, 4 plates on a table that had held two for 5 years. She opened the front door. Caleb stood with his back to her. Rain darkened his shirt. Rain dripped from his jaw. His hands were still open, still receiving. She almost said something else, almost said something careful and measured, the kind of thing a woman says when she's afraid of wanting too much. But Nora Ellison hadn't survived 5 years alone by being careful. She'd survived by being honest. "Supper's almost ready," she said. "There's 4 plates." He turned, rain on his face, rain in his open hands. He looked at her standing in the doorway of the home he'd rebuilt board by board, and he nodded once, and that nod held more than a year's worth of words. The door he'd just fitted with new hinges swung shut behind them, smooth and silent and true. Inside, Willa Mae and Eli pressed their faces to the window glass, watching the rain come down, already arguing about the last biscuit, while two people who'd forgotten how to ask for love took their seats at a table set for a family. Spring came late to Briar Hollow that year, but it came. The cottonwoods leafed out in pale green along the creek, which ran again for the first time since June. Nora's garden pushed up in rows so straight that Willa Mae declared they looked like sentences in a book, each one saying something green and growing. The new well held strong. The cabin stood solid against the April wind, every board snug, every joint true, and the porch didn't creak anymore when you crossed it. Though Nora sometimes missed the sound because it used to mean she was the only one home, she wasn't the only one home anymore. Mornings had a rhythm now. Caleb worked on something. There was always something. Because a cabin is a living thing, and living things always need tending. Nora saw Patience in the front room, her shelves full again with tinctures brewed from well water that tasted of clean stone. Willa Mae read to Eli on the porch beside the bookshelf that had started everything, and Eli listened with the same quiet attention his father gave to a crooked board, studying each word like it was something he might need to build with later. Caleb had built a second shelf for Eli, smaller, simpler, set beside the first one in Willa Mae's room, not because the boy had his own books yet, but because Willa Mae had started lending him hers and insisted that borrowed books deserved a proper place to stand. Eli arranged them each night before bed, lining the spines up careful, and Caleb would watch from the doorway and feel something in his chest he'd stopped trying to name because naming it might break it. Suppers were the best part. 4 plates, every evening, Caleb in the warm seat, Nora across from him. children between them making the kind of noise that only sounds like chaos to someone who's never sat in a quiet house and wished for it. This particular evening, the dishes were washed and the children were meant to be sleeping. Caleb stood at the front door, always that door, tightening a hinge that didn't need tightening because some habits are how a man says, I am still here and I am not leaving. Willa Mae was not quite asleep. She lay in bed listening to the sounds of a house that held four people instead of two. Mr. Caleb's hammer, soft taps, careful work. Her mother putting away the last clean pot. Eli breathing steady and deep in the cot beside the stove, the way a boy breathes when he knows he is safe. She padded to the doorway in her stockinged feet. Her mother stood in the hall, looking toward the front of the house where lamplight moved, and a hammer tapped, and a man did what he had always done, which was to build love out of whatever scrap the world left lying around. Mama, Willa Mae whispered, is Mr. Caleb staying? Nora looked at her daughter. Then she looked down the hall at the man fixing her door, his hands steady in the lamplight, the same hands that had carried a fevered boy up these steps in July and hadn't truly stopped reaching for this family since. I think he already has, she said. Willa Mae smiled and went back to bed. She pulled the covers to her chin and looked at her bookshelf in the dark, every shelf full, each one built by hand from scrap timber by a man who noticed things and never said a word about it. Outside, rain fell soft on a mended roof. The well held water. The fence stood straight. The door swung true. And in a cabin at the edge of Briar Hollow, Wyoming Territory, four plates sat drying beside a basin because some debts ain't paid in coin and some love don't need a single word to make itself heard. Spring comes late sometimes, but it comes.